What would you do if you discovered a note in your child's school bag that could destroy everything you've worked to protect? For Kate Middleton, this nightmare became reality on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. As she helped Prince George unpack his school things at Kensington Palace, her fingers brushed against something that shouldn't have been there. A folded piece of paper, hidden beneath his geography textbook, contained words that made her blood run cold. The note wasn't from a teacher. It wasn't from a classmate. It was something far more sinister, something that threatened not just George's safety, but the very foundation of the royal family's carefully guarded privacy. In that moment, Kate realized that someone had been watching them, learning their routines, and now they wanted something in return for their silence. What started as a simple after-school routine would spiral into the most terrifying week of Kate's life, forcing her to question everything she thought she knew about protecting her family. 'Cause sometimes, the greatest threats come from the places you least expect. And this time, the danger had followed her 10-year-old son right through the palace gates. This is the true story of how a mother's worst fear became reality, and how the future Queen of England had to choose between her family's safety and everything she held dear. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Kensington Palace as Catherine, the Princess of Wales, glanced at her watch for the third time in 5 minutes. 3:45. Prince George would be home from Thomas's Battersea any moment now, and she had promised to help him with his history project about medieval castles. It was one of those rare afternoons when her royal duties allowed her to be just a mother, waiting for her son to burst through the doors with stories about his day. Kate had always treasured these simple moments. Despite the constant scrutiny and the weight of royal protocol that governed nearly every aspect of their lives, she was determined to give her children as normal a childhood as possible. The sound of car doors closing in the courtyard below told her that George had arrived with his protection officer, and she smiled, setting aside the briefing papers she had been reviewing for tomorrow's charity visit. George's footsteps echoed in the hallway before he appeared in the doorway of the sitting room, still wearing his Navy school uniform, his tie slightly askew, and his sandy hair tousled from the autumn wind. At 10 years old, he was already showing signs of the Windsor height, though his face still held the roundness of childhood that made Kate's heart squeeze with protective love. "Mummy, we learned about siege engines today," he announced, dropping his heavy school bag on the Persian rug with a thud that made Kate wince slightly. "Did you know they could throw stones that weighed as much as a car?" "I did not know that," Kate replied, reaching out to straighten his tie. "That sounds fascinating. Why don't you wash your hands and we can start on your castle project? I thought we could research Warwick Castle since we visited there last summer." George nodded enthusiastically and bounded toward the bathroom, leaving his bag where it had fallen. Kate shook her head with fond exasperation and bent to pick it up, intending to set it properly by his desk. The bag was heavier than she expected, stuffed full with textbooks, notebooks, and what felt like half the contents of his locker. As she lifted it, the zipper, which George had clearly not closed properly, gave way, and several items spilled onto the floor. His mathematics workbook landed face down, revealing pages of calculations in his careful handwriting. His pencil case scattered its contents across the rug, and his geography textbook fell open to a chapter about river systems. Kate knelt to gather the scattered items, smiling at the typical chaos of a 10-year-old's belongings. It was as she reached for the geography book that she saw it, a folded piece of paper that had been tucked beneath the textbook, almost deliberately hidden. The paper was cream-colored and of good quality, distinctly different from the cheap notebook paper that George typically used for school assignments. Something about the paper made her pause. George was meticulous about his schoolwork, just as William had been at that age, and he rarely left loose papers floating in his bag. Most of his work was neatly organized in subject folders or securely fastened in his notebooks. This paper seemed out of place, almost foreign among his familiar school supplies. Kate picked up the paper, intending to simply add it to the pile with his other belongings, but something about the way it was folded gave her pause. It wasn't folded like a typical school note or assignment. Instead, it was folded with the precision of someone who wanted to ensure its contents remained private, the edges creased with deliberate care. Her maternal instinct, honed by years of protecting her children from the intrusive nature of royal life, began to sound a quiet alarm. George received notes from classmates occasionally, invitations to birthday parties, questions about homework, the typical communications of childhood friendship. But those notes usually looked hastily scribbled and carelessly folded. This was different. The paper felt slightly heavier than normal writing paper, and as Kate held it up to the light streaming through the window, she could see that there was definitely writing inside. Neat, adult handwriting rather than the scrawled letters of a 10-year-old. Her heart began to beat a little faster as possibilities raced through her mind. Perhaps it was a note from a teacher about George's progress, though that would typically come through official channels or in his school diary. Maybe it was information about a school trip or event. Though again, such communications usually arrived in official envelopes. The protective instincts that had been carefully cultivated over years of royal life, years of being constantly aware that her family was always in the public eye and potentially at risk, began to stir more urgently. Kate had learned to trust these instincts. They had served her well in navigating the complex world of royal duty while protecting her children's innocence and privacy. She could hear George in the bathroom, the sound of water running and his voice humming tunelessly as he washed his hands. William was in meetings at St. James's Palace and wouldn't be home for another hour. The palace staff were going about their duties in other parts of the building, leaving Kate alone with this mysterious piece of paper and a growing sense that something was not quite right. Kate's training in royal protocol had taught her the importance of discretion and careful consideration before taking action. Every decision she made, no matter how small, had the potential to affect not just her family but the monarchy itself. But this was about George, her firstborn, her future king, and the protective mother in her was stronger than any protocol. She carefully unfolded the paper, her hands steady despite the nervous energy coursing through her. The handwriting was indeed adult, neat, precise, and deliberately legible. It was written with what appeared to be an expensive pen, the ink dark and clean against the cream paper. But it was the content of the message that made Kate's breath catch in her throat and her hands begin to tremble. The message was brief, but its implications were staggering. It wasn't a threat in the traditional sense. There were no demands for ransom, no explicit menaces against George's safety. Instead, it was something far more insidious and in many ways more terrifying. It was proof that someone had been watching her family, studying their routines, learning details about their private lives that should have been impossible for any outsider to know. The note referenced specific details about George's daily routine that went far beyond what any casual observer could have noticed. It mentioned the route he took to his classroom each morning, the name of his favorite teacher, and even details about his lunch preferences that were known only to the family and their most trusted staff. Most chilling of all, it included information about a private conversation Kate had had with George just the week before about his concerns regarding an upcoming school presentation. That conversation had taken place in George's bedroom at Kensington Palace, behind multiple layers of security, in what Kate had believed to be complete privacy. The fact that someone knew the details of that intimate mother-son moment made her feel physically sick and violated in a way that was almost overwhelming. But the message didn't stop at demonstrating this impossible knowledge. It concluded with a simple statement that made Kate's blood run cold. "We need to talk. More information to follow. Keep this between us for everyone's safety." The paper trembled in Kate's hands as the full implications of the message began to sink in. Someone had not only managed to penetrate the security around her son, but had done so with such skill and precision that they could gather intimate details about their private family life. Whoever had written this note wanted her to know that they had access, that they had been watching, and that they wanted something from her. The casual mention of everyone's safety carried an unmistakable undertone of threat, despite its seemingly polite phrasing. It was a threat delivered with sophistication and subtlety, but a threat nonetheless. Someone was telling her that they had the power to harm her family and that her cooperation was expected. Kate's mind raced as she tried to process what this meant. How had this note ended up in George's school bag? Had someone at his school been compromised? Was there a security breach among the staff at Kensington Palace? How long had someone been watching them, and what did they ultimately want? The sound of George's footsteps returning from the bathroom snapped Kate back to the present moment. She quickly refolded the note and slipped it into her pocket, forcing her expression into something resembling normalcy as her son appeared in the doorway, his hands clean and his face bright with anticipation for their afternoon together. "Ready for the castle project, Mummy?" George asked, seemingly oblivious to his mother's internal turmoil. "Of course, darling," Kate managed, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind. "Let's gather your things and set up at the desk." As she helped George organize his school supplies, Kate's mind was already working through the implications of what she had discovered. Every protocol she had learned about security threats was running through her head, but this situation didn't fit any of the scenarios she had been prepared for. This wasn't a stranger making wild threats from a distance. This was someone with access, someone with knowledge, someone who had managed to get close enough to her family to know their most private moments. The worst part was the instruction to keep this between them. Kate knew that protocol demanded she immediately report any security threat to the Royal Protection Unit, but the note's warning about everyone's safety made her hesitate. What if involving security escalated the situation in a way that put George in more danger? What if the person behind this note had anticipated her likely response and was prepared to act if she didn't follow their instructions? As George chattered about siege engines and castle defenses, Kate found herself studying his innocent face and wondering what else this mysterious person might know about her children. Did they know about Charlotte's dance classes? About Louis's favorite bedtime stories? Had they been watching all of her children, or was George specifically targeted because of his position as future king? The afternoon that had begun with such promise, with the simple joy of helping her son with his homework, had suddenly become something much darker and more complex. Kate realized that she was facing a decision that would test every instinct she had developed as both a mother and a member of the royal family. She could follow protocol and immediately alert security, potentially escalating a situation that might put her family in danger. Or she could follow the note's instructions and wait to see what this person wanted, keeping her children in the dark while trying to handle a threat she didn't fully understand. As George opened his history textbook and began reading about medieval fortifications, Kate found herself wondering if their own carefully constructed fortress of security and privacy had already been breached in ways they didn't yet understand. The note in her pocket felt like it was burning against her leg, a constant reminder that someone somewhere was watching her family with intentions that remained ominously unclear. The afternoon sun continued to stream through the windows of Kensington Palace, but for Kate, the day had suddenly become much darker. The simple act of helping her son unpack his school bag had revealed a threat that challenged everything she thought she knew about keeping her family safe. And as George innocently worked on his project about castle defenses, Kate realized that their real-life defenses might not be as impenetrable as she had once believed. The next morning arrived with a kind of gray London drizzle that seemed to match Kate's mood perfectly. She had barely slept, spending most of the night staring at the ceiling while William slept peacefully beside her, completely unaware of the crisis that was consuming his wife's thoughts. The note remained hidden in her jewelry box, but its contents had burned themselves into her memory with crystal clarity. Kate had gone through her morning routine with mechanical precision, helping Charlotte and Louis get ready for their day while George prepared for another day at Thomas's Battersea. Every interaction with her children felt weighted with new significance. When George asked for help finding his rugby boots, she found herself studying his face for any sign that he knew about the note. When Charlotte mentioned a new friend at school, Kate wondered if someone was using her daughter to gather information as well. The school run that morning felt different from every other school run she had undertaken. Kate found herself hyper-aware of every person they passed, every car that seemed to linger too long at traffic lights, every face in the crowd that looked their way. The protection officers maintained their usual professional composure, but Kate wondered if they had noticed any changes in routine or if there were threats they weren't telling her about. After dropping the children off at their respective schools, Kate returned to Kensington Palace with her mind made up about one thing. She needed to know more before she could decide how to handle this situation. The note had promised more information to follow, and she found herself both dreading and anticipating whatever was coming next. Her first engagement of the day was a visit to a children's hospital in central London, one that had been planned for months and involved dozens of staff members, security personnel, and media representatives. As Kate moved through the familiar routine of royal visits, greeting officials, meeting with patients and families, touring facilities, her mind kept drifting back to the mysterious note and what it might mean for her family's safety. The children at the hospital were delighted to see her, their faces lighting up with genuine joy that usually brought Kate immense satisfaction. Today, however, she found herself wondering if any of the staff members or visitors might be watching her, for reasons that had nothing to do with royal protocol or genuine admiration. The paranoia that was beginning to creep into her thoughts felt foreign and uncomfortable, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her every movement was being observed and catalogued by unfriendly eyes. During the drive back to Kensington Palace, Kate's phone buzzed with a text message from George's school. Her heart immediately began racing, and she almost dropped the phone in her haste to read the message. It was from his form teacher, asking if she could call about George's participation in an upcoming school play. Under normal circumstances, such a message would have filled Kate with maternal pride and excitement. Today, it felt like another potential threat, another way that someone might be trying to reach her or gather information about her family. The conversation with George's teacher was perfectly normal, filled with praise for George's enthusiasm and natural stage presence. But even as Kate discussed costume requirements and rehearsal schedules, part of her mind was analyzing every word for hidden meanings or subtle threats. The teacher's casual mention that George had been a bit distracted lately sent a chill down Kate's spine. Though she tried to tell herself that 10-year-old boys were naturally prone to distraction. Back at the palace, Kate tried to focus on her correspondence and preparations for upcoming engagements, but concentration proved impossible. Every phone call felt potentially significant, every piece of mail seemed to require extra scrutiny, and every member of staff who approached her sparked a moment of anxiety. The note had succeeded in making her feel vulnerable and exposed in ways that years of royal training had never prepared her for. It was just after lunch when her private secretary knocked on her office door and entered with a concerned expression. Kate's heart immediately began racing, convinced that more threatening messages had arrived, or that some crisis had befallen her children. Instead, her secretary simply informed her that a package had arrived for her, hand-delivered by a courier service but with no return address or identifying information about the sender. The package was small and neatly wrapped in brown paper, tied with ordinary string. There was nothing particularly threatening about its appearance, but given the circumstances, Kate's hands trembled slightly as she took it from her secretary. She managed to maintain her composure until she was alone in her office, but once the door closed behind her secretary, Kate stared at the package with growing apprehension. The handwriting on the address label was the same neat, precise script that had written the note she had found in George's school bag. There was no doubt that this package came from the same person, and Kate realized that the promised more information was now sitting on her desk, waiting to be opened. Kate's training in crisis management told her that she should immediately call security and have the package professionally examined before opening it. Protocol demanded that any unsolicited packages delivered to royal residences be treated as potential threats until proven otherwise. But the note's warning about keeping things quiet for everyone's safety echoed in her mind, and she hesitated to take any action that might escalate the situation. After several minutes of internal debate, Kate carefully untied the string and unwrapped the brown paper. Inside was a simple cardboard box, the kind that might contain jewelry or small electronics. Her hands were definitely shaking now as she lifted the lid and peered inside. The box contained a USB drive and another note, along with what appeared to be a small photograph. Kate's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the photograph. It was an image of George walking into his school building that very morning, taken from an angle that suggested the photographer had been positioned across the street from the school entrance. The timestamp in the corner indicated it had been taken just hours ago, less than an hour after Kate had dropped him off. The realization that someone had been watching and photographing her son that very morning, perhaps at the exact moment she was dropping him off, hit Kate like a physical blow. This wasn't just about gathering information or making vague threats. Someone was actively monitoring her children in real time, with the technical capability to deliver photographic evidence of their surveillance within hours. The second note was longer than the first, written in the same careful handwriting but with a tone that was both more specific and more menacing. It began with an acknowledgement that Kate had likely found the first note and was probably concerned about its implications. The writer seemed to anticipate her emotional state, with an accuracy that felt deeply unsettling. The note went on to explain that the USB drive contained video footage that would demonstrate the extent of their knowledge about the royal family's private activities. It assured Kate that this footage had been obtained through careful observation and technical expertise, but insisted that no laws had been broken and that her family was in no immediate physical danger. However, the note continued. The writer had information and evidence that could be extremely damaging to the royal family if it became public. The note didn't specify what this information concerned, but it hinted at secrets that went beyond simple privacy violations, suggesting knowledge of matters that could affect the monarchy itself. The final paragraph of the note contained the first explicit demand. The writer wanted to arrange a private meeting with Kate, away from royal security and official protocols. They suggested a specific location, a small cafe in a quiet part of London that Kate had visited once or twice for unofficial meetings with charity representatives. The choice of location demonstrated yet another layer of their knowledge about her habits and preferences. The note concluded with a deadline. Kate had 48 hours to confirm her willingness to meet, or the information they possessed would be shared with certain media outlets that would find it particularly interesting. The threat was delivered with the same polite, almost apologetic tone that had characterized both notes. But the underlying menace was unmistakable. Kate stared at the USB drive with a mixture of terror and morbid curiosity. Part of her desperately wanted to see what was on it, to understand the full scope of what this person knew about her family. But another part of her was terrified of what she might discover, afraid that the evidence might be even more damaging than the notes had suggested. The photograph of George felt like it was burning her fingers as she held it. The casual, almost professional quality of the image suggested that taking it had been easy for the photographer, that getting close enough to her children to document their activities was well within their capabilities. The thought of unknown eyes watching her children, studying their routines and recording their movements made Kate feel sick with a combination of rage and helplessness. As the afternoon wore on, Kate found herself unable to concentrate on anything else. Every phone call from the children's school sent her into a panic, convinced that something terrible had happened. Every report from the protection officers about routine security matters felt potentially significant. The weight of the secret she was carrying, combined with the deadline she had been given, created a pressure that felt almost unbearable. When William returned from his engagements that evening, Kate struggled to maintain normal conversation. She helped with bath time and bedtime stories, but her mind kept drifting to the USB drive locked in her office safe and the impossible decision she was being forced to make. George seemed completely normal, chatting about his day at school and his excitement about the upcoming play, apparently oblivious to the fact that he had been photographed and was being used as leverage against his mother. That night, after William had fallen asleep, Kate crept back to her office and stared at the USB drive. The need to understand what she was dealing with finally overcame her fear, and she inserted the drive into her computer with trembling hands. What she found on the drive was worse than she had imagined. There were video clips spanning several weeks, showing moments of private family life that should have been impossible for any outsider to capture. There was footage of George playing in the private gardens at Kensington Palace, video of Charlotte practicing piano in what Kate had thought was a completely secure room, and even clips of family conversations during meals. The technical quality of the footage suggested sophisticated equipment and expert planning. These weren't grainy, distant shots taken with amateur equipment. These were clear, well-lit videos that captured both images and audio with professional precision. Whoever was behind this had invested significant time, money, and expertise in their surveillance operation. But it was the final video on the drive that truly terrified Kate. It showed her and William having a private conversation in their bedroom about sensitive royal business discussions, about other royal family members, conversations about political matters that were meant to remain strictly confidential, and personal opinions that could cause significant diplomatic and family problems if they became public. Kate realized that she wasn't just dealing with someone who had managed to spy on her children. She was facing someone who had somehow managed to penetrate the most secure areas of Kensington Palace and record conversations that could destabilize relationships, both within the royal family and with important political allies. As she sat in her office in the early hours of the morning, staring at the evidence of this impossible breach of security, Kate understood that the 48-hour deadline wasn't just about arranging a meeting. It was about choosing between her family's immediate safety and the long-term stability of the monarchy itself. and she had less than 36 hours left to make that choice. The following morning brought no relief from Kate's mounting anxiety. She had managed only a few hours of restless sleep, her dreams filled with shadowy figures watching her children and cameras hidden in every corner of what should have been their safe spaces. As she went through the motions of her morning routine, Kate felt as though she were acting in a play where everyone else knew their lines except her. William noticed her distraction over breakfast, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand as the children chattered about their plans for the day. "Everything all right, darling?" he asked quietly, his blue eyes filled with concern. "You seem rather distant this morning." Kate forced a smile, the deception feeling like acid in her throat. "Just thinking about the hospital visit next week," she lied, hating herself for the words even as they left her mouth, "making sure we have everything organized properly." George looked up from his cereal, his young face serious. "Mummy, you look tired. Did you have bad dreams again?" The innocent question pierced Kate's heart. George had always been sensitive to the moods of those around him, a trait that would serve him well as a future king, but that made hiding her current crisis nearly impossible. "Just grown-up worries, sweetheart," she managed. "Nothing for you to concern yourself with." As the family prepared to leave for their respective commitments, William to a series of meetings about conservation initiatives, the children to their schools, Kate felt the weight of the deadline pressing down on her like a physical force. 24 hours remained before she had to make her decision, and she was no closer to knowing the right course of action. The morning's engagement was a visit to a technology center that worked with disadvantaged youth, the kind of meaningful interaction that usually energized Kate and reminded her why she had embraced royal duty. Today, however, as she toured the facilities and spoke with young people about their projects and aspirations, Kate found herself thinking about surveillance technology and wondering how someone might have managed to penetrate Kensington Palace's security. During a break between presentations, Kate stepped outside with her protection officer for what appeared to be a routine moment of fresh air. In reality, she was desperately trying to clear her head and find a solution to her impossible situation. The autumn air was crisp and clean, but it did nothing to ease the suffocating feeling that had settled over her since discovering the first note. It was then that she noticed a figure across the street, partially hidden by a parked van, but clearly watching the technology center. The person was dressed casually, carrying what appeared to be a newspaper, but their posture and positioning suggested they were there for more than casual observation. Kate's protection officer noticed her attention and followed her gaze, but by the time he focused on the area, the figure had melted away into the crowd. "Ma'am?" the protection officer asked quietly. "Is something concerning you?" Kate hesitated, knowing that this might be her last chance to involve official security before the deadline expired. But the memory of the morning's photograph of George, and the implied threat that came with it, held her back. "No," she said finally. "I thought I recognized someone, but I was mistaken." The lie felt heavier than the others she had been forced to tell, because it actively prevented the very people whose job it was to protect her from doing what they were trained to do. But the note's warning about everyone's safety echoed in her mind, and she couldn't risk escalating the situation without understanding more about what she was dealing with. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of forced smiles and appropriate responses to questions she'd barely heard. Kate's mind kept returning to the USB drive and its contents, trying to make sense of how such extensive surveillance could have been conducted without detection. The technical sophistication required suggested resources and expertise that went far beyond what a lone stalker or amateur photographer might possess. By afternoon, Kate had made a decision that went against every instinct she had developed during her years in royal service. She was going to the meeting, not because she trusted the person who had been threatening her family, but because she needed to understand the full scope of what they were dealing with before she could figure out how to protect her children. The cafe they had chosen was in Notting Hill, a small establishment that Kate had visited twice before for informal meetings with charity representatives. It was the kind of place where someone could sit quietly with a coffee and newspaper without attracting attention, but it was also public enough that Kate felt reasonably safe from physical harm. Arranging to visit the cafe without her protection detail required careful planning and a level of deception that made Kate feel sick with guilt. She told her private secretary that she wanted to do some personal shopping in Notting Hill and would be taking one of the palace cars for a private afternoon. She specifically requested minimal security, claiming that she wanted to move quietly and avoid drawing attention to herself. The request wasn't entirely unusual. Royal family members occasionally made such arrangements for personal errands, but Kate had never felt more like she was betraying the trust of the people whose job it was to keep her safe. As she changed into civilian clothes and prepared to leave Kensington Palace, Kate felt as though she were crossing a line that she might never be able to uncross. The drive to Notting Hill felt endless, despite lasting only 20 minutes. Kate sat in the back of the unmarked car, her hands folded tightly in her lap to stop them from shaking. She had left her usual jewelry at home and chosen simple, unremarkable clothing that would help her blend in among the cafe's regular customers. For perhaps the first time since her marriage, Kate was actively trying to avoid being recognized as a member of the royal family. The cafe was busier than she had expected, filled with the kind of eclectic mix of customers that characterized Notting Hill young professionals on laptops, elderly couples sharing afternoon tea, students with textbooks spread across small tables. Kate ordered a coffee and chose a table near the window, positioning herself so that she could observe the other customers while keeping an eye on the street outside. She had been waiting for nearly 15 minutes, beginning to wonder if this had all been an elaborate hoax, when a woman approached her table with confidence and purpose that immediately told Kate this was her contact. The woman was probably in her 40s, professionally dressed but unremarkable in appearance, with the kind of face that would easily disappear in a crowd. "Your Royal Highness," the woman said quietly, taking the seat across from Kate without invitation. "Thank you for coming." Kate studied the woman's face, looking for any clues about her identity or intentions. She was well-spoken with an educated accent that suggested upper-middle-class background and quality education. There was nothing obviously threatening about her appearance, but her eyes held an intelligence and calculation that made Kate deeply uncomfortable. "Who are you?" Kate asked, keeping her voice low but allowing some of her anger to show through. "What do you want from my family?" The woman smiled slightly, expression that didn't reach her eyes. "My name isn't important, Your Royal Highness. What matters is what I represent and what I know about your family's secrets." She reached into her handbag and withdrew a tablet computer, placing it on the table between them. With a few quick touches, she brought up what appeared to be a detailed file containing photographs, documents, and video clips. Kate's heart sank as she recognized images from the USB drive mixed with additional material she hadn't seen before. "The surveillance footage you've seen represents only a small fraction of what we've collected," the woman continued in the same calm, professional tone. "We've been documenting your family's activities for several months now, using a combination of technical surveillance and human intelligence sources." Kate felt her blood run cold at the casual mention of human intelligence sources, the implication that people she trusted might have been feeding information to these mysterious watchers. "Human sources?" she managed to ask. "People talk, Your Royal Highness," the woman replied with a slight shrug. "Staff members who feel undervalued, security personnel with gambling debts, contractors who need extra income. It's remarkable what people will share for the right incentive." The suggestion that her own staff might have been compromised hit Kate like a physical blow. She thought about all the people who had access to her family's private spaces: housekeepers, security officers, maintenance workers, gardeners. The idea that any of them might have been secretly working against her family's interests filled her with a nausea that had nothing to do with the coffee she had been trying to drink. "But surveillance and gossip are just the beginning," the woman continued, scrolling through the tablet to reveal documents that made Kate's eyes widen in recognition. "We also have documentary evidence of certain financial arrangements, political communications, and personal matters that would be extremely embarrassing if they became public." Kate recognized copies of private correspondence between William and other royal family members, financial documents related to the children's trust funds, and what appeared to be transcripts of conversations with government officials about sensitive political matters. The scope of the material suggested a level of access that should have been impossible without insider assistance at the highest levels. "What do you want?" Kate asked, though she dreaded the answer. The woman leaned back in her chair, studying Kate with the satisfaction of someone who held all the cards. "We want information," she said simply. "Specific information about upcoming royal decisions, advance notice of policy changes, and access to private communications between family members." Kate stared at her in disbelief. You're asking me to spy on my own family. I'm asking you to provide information that prevents much more damaging material from becoming public," the woman corrected. "Think of it as damage control rather than espionage." The woman went on to explain that Kate would be contacted regularly with specific requests for information. Some requests would be about upcoming royal announcements or policy decisions. Others would concern private family matters or personal relationships within the royal household. In exchange for this cooperation, the surveillance footage and other compromising materials would remain private. "And if I refuse?" Kate asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. The woman's smile became less pleasant. "Then the material we've collected would find its way to various media outlets that would find it extremely newsworthy. Imagine the headlines, 'Your Royal Highness.' Think about how the public would react to seeing private family moments, reading private communications, learning about certain financial arrangements that might not look entirely appropriate." Kate could indeed imagine the headlines, and the thought filled her with a despair that felt overwhelming. The material they had collected would not just embarrass her family, it could potentially destabilize the monarchy itself, damage relationships with political allies, and expose her children to a level of public scrutiny that would destroy any chance they had of a normal childhood. But the alternative, becoming a source of information about her own family, betraying the trust of people she loved, potentially compromising state secrets, felt equally impossible to contemplate. "I need time to think," Kate said finally. The woman nodded as though she had expected this response. "You have until tomorrow evening," she said, gathering up her tablet and preparing to leave. "We'll contact you with instructions for how to respond. But, Your Royal Highness, I hope you'll consider carefully what's at stake here. The well-being of your children should be your primary concern." As the woman walked away, disappearing into the crowd on the street outside, Kate sat alone at the cafe table, staring at her untouched coffee and trying to process what had just happened. She had hoped that meeting face-to-face might give her some insight into how to handle the situation, but instead, she felt more trapped and helpless than ever before. The walk back to her car felt like a journey through a nightmare. Every person on the street might be watching her, every camera might be recording her movements, every decision she made from this point forward would be weighed against the threat hanging over her family's heads. As Kate drove back toward Kensington Palace, she realized that her life had been fundamentally changed by the events of the past few days. The simple act of helping George unpack his school bag had revealed a threat that challenged not just her family's safety and privacy, but her most basic beliefs about loyalty, protection, and the price of royal duty. She had less than 24 hours to make a decision that would define the rest of her life. And she still had no idea what the right choice might be. Kate returned to Kensington Palace that afternoon, feeling as though she had aged years in a matter of hours. The familiar sight of the palace gates, which had always represented safety and security, now felt like the walls of a prison. She knew that cameras were recording her arrival, that security personnel were noting her return, and that every move she made was being monitored by people whose job it was to protect her. The irony that she now felt threatened by the very surveillance meant to keep her safe was not lost on her. The children were already home from school when Kate arrived, their voices echoing through the hallways as they played together before dinner. The sound of their laughter, which usually filled Kate with joy, now made her heart ache with the knowledge of the impossible choice she was facing. Charlotte's giggle, Louise's excited chatter, and George's patient voice explaining some game to his younger siblings all served as painful reminders of what was at stake. George bounded up to her as she entered the family sitting room, his face bright with enthusiasm. "Mummy, guess what?" "Mrs. Henderson said my castle project was one of the best in the class, and she wants to display it in the school library." Kate forced herself to smile and respond appropriately to George's news, praising his hard work and asking about the details of his presentation. But even as she engaged with her son's excited storytelling, part of her mind was calculating the implications of his public recognition. Would this make him more visible to the people who were watching their family? Would increased attention at school create more opportunities for surveillance or threats? The paranoia that had been growing since she first found the note was beginning to color every aspect of her thinking. Kate found herself studying the faces of the palace staff who came and went throughout the evening, wondering if any of them might be the human intelligence sources that the woman in the cafe had mentioned. the housekeeper who had been with them for 3 years, the security officer who always asked about the children's activities, the maintenance worker who had access to every room in their private quarters. Any of them might have been sharing information about her family's most intimate moments. Dinner that evening was a particular torture, as the family sat around the table sharing stories about their day and making plans for the weekend. Kate felt as though she were watching them through the eyes of the people who had been spying on them. She found herself consciously moderating her words, afraid that even their dinner conversation might be somehow recorded and used against them. William noticed her distraction and asked privately if she was feeling unwell. Kate's heart broke a little more as she lied to her husband once again, claiming that she was simply tired from a busy day of engagements. The ease with which the deception came to her lips frightened her almost as much as the situation she was trying to hide. After the children were settled for the night, Kate retreated to her office and stared at the secure phone that would connect her directly to the head of royal security. She had lifted the receiver a dozen times throughout the evening, ready to confess everything and seek official help in dealing with the threat. Each time, however, the memory of the woman's casual confidence and the sophistication of the surveillance operation made her hesitate. These people had managed to penetrate multiple layers of security, corrupt staff members who had undergone extensive background checks. If they were capable of such extensive infiltration, what might they be capable of if they felt cornered or threatened by official intervention? Kate spent most of the night reviewing the evidence she had been shown, trying to understand the full scope of what the mysterious organization had gathered about her family. The financial documents they had obtained suggested access to information that should have been restricted to the highest levels of royal administration. The political communications indicated knowledge of state matters that could compromise national security if they became public. But it was the personal material that truly devastated Kate. The surveillance footage showed moments of vulnerability and intimacy that no parent should have to worry about strangers witnessing. There were clips of bedtime stories, private conversations between siblings, and quiet family moments that represented everything Kate had tried to protect about her children's childhood. The thought of this material being broadcast to the world, becoming the subject of tabloid speculation and public judgment, filled Kate with a desperation that made rational thought almost impossible. She could imagine the commentary, the analysis of their parenting decisions, the invasion of privacy that would follow her children for the rest of their lives. As dawn approached, Kate made a decision that went against every principle she had developed during her years of royal service. She was going to comply with their demands, at least initially, while she worked to find another solution. The risk of immediate exposure seemed too great, the potential consequences too devastating, to take any other course of action. The decision brought no relief, only a different kind of anguish. Kate understood that by choosing to cooperate, she was stepping onto a path that might lead to years of deception and betrayal. Once she began providing information to these people, there would be no clear endpoint. No guarantee that their demands wouldn't escalate, no assurance that compliance would ultimately protect her family. The next morning brought a text message to Kate's private phone, a number that was supposed to be known only to family members and the most trusted palace staff. The message was brief and professional in tone, providing instructions for how she should respond to indicate her willingness to cooperate. The casual breach of her private communications felt like another violation, another demonstration of how thoroughly these people had infiltrated her life. Kate responded as instructed, using a specific phrase that would signal her compliance. Within hours, she received detailed instructions for her first assignment. The request seemed relatively harmless. Information about the timing of an upcoming announcement regarding a new charitable initiative. But Kate understood that this was just the beginning, a test to see if she would follow through on her agreement. Providing the requested information required Kate to access files that were meant to remain confidential until the official announcement. As she copied the relevant details and prepared to send them through the secure communication method she had been given, Kate felt as though she were betraying not just her family, but every person who had trusted her with sensitive information. The days that followed established a pattern that became increasingly difficult to maintain. Requests for information arrived regularly, each one slightly more sensitive than the last. Kate found herself keeping mental notes about family conversations, photographing documents when she thought no one was watching, and gradually becoming the very threat to royal security that she had always been protected against. The psychological toll was enormous. Kate began having trouble sleeping, lost weight from stress, and found it increasingly difficult to concentrate on her royal duties. William noticed the changes and expressed growing concern about her health, but Kate's repeated reassurances became more and more hollow as the weeks passed. The breaking point came when Kate received a request that crossed a line she hadn't even known existed. The organization wanted detailed information about Prince Louis's medical records, specifically regarding a minor condition that had required discreet treatment by a specialist. The request was accompanied by a reminder that non-compliance would result in the immediate release of all the surveillance material they had gathered. Staring at the message, Kate realized that she had reached the limits of what she could sacrifice to protect her family's immediate safety. The idea of compromising her youngest child's medical privacy, of turning his health information into currency for blackmailers, filled her with a revulsion that overcame her fear of consequences. That night, after the children were asleep, Kate finally made the phone call she had been avoiding for weeks. She contacted the head of royal security and requested an emergency meeting for the following morning. The conversation was brief and professional, but Kate could hear the concern in the security chief's voice as she insisted that the matter was urgent and required absolute discretion. The meeting took place in a secure room at St. James's Palace, with only Kate and two of the most senior security officials present. As Kate began to explain what had been happening to her family, she felt as though a massive weight was being lifted from her shoulders, even as she prepared for the consequences that might follow. The security officials listened to her account with professional composure, but Kate could see the alarm in their eyes as she described the scope of the surveillance and the sophistication of the operation they were dealing with. When she produced copies of the evidence she had been shown, their expressions became even more grave. What followed was the most intensive security investigation in the history of the modern royal family. Within hours, technical experts were sweeping Kensington Palace for surveillance equipment. Background checks were being conducted on every staff member with access to the royal family, and a joint task force involving multiple government agencies was formed to track down the organization behind the threats. The investigation revealed the shocking scope of the infiltration. Hidden cameras had been installed in multiple rooms throughout the palace, some of them so sophisticated that they had evaded regular security sweeps. Several staff members had indeed been compromised, either through bribery or blackmail, and were providing regular reports about the family's activities and conversations. Most disturbing of all, the investigation uncovered evidence that the organization behind the surveillance had connections to foreign intelligence services, suggesting that the threats against Kate's family were part of a larger operation designed to compromise the British royal family and potentially influence government policy. The arrests began within days. The woman who had met Kate at the cafe was identified as a former intelligence operative who had been operating under a false identity. Several palace staff members were taken into custody, and a complex network of surveillance equipment was dismantled. The technical sophistication of the operation confirmed Kate's instincts about the level of resources and expertise involved. But perhaps the most important outcome of the investigation was the implementation of new security protocols that would make such an infiltration virtually impossible in the future. The entire security apparatus around the royal family was restructured, with new oversight mechanisms and technical safeguards that addressed the vulnerabilities that had been exploited. For Kate, the resolution of the crisis brought both relief and lasting trauma. The immediate threat to her family had been eliminated, and the people responsible were being held accountable for their crimes. But the knowledge of how thoroughly their privacy had been violated, how completely they had been watched and recorded during their most intimate moments, would take much longer to overcome. The children were told only that there had been a security concern that had been resolved, and their lives returned to a semblance of normalcy remarkably quickly. George continued to excel at school. Charlotte pursued her various interests with characteristic enthusiasm, and Louis remained blissfully unaware that he had ever been in danger. William struggled more with the revelation that his wife had faced such an ordeal alone for weeks before seeking help. The knowledge that Kate had tried to protect their family by sacrificing her own well-being while simultaneously feeling unable to trust him with the truth forced difficult conversations about the pressures and isolation that could come with royal duty. In the months that followed, Kate often reflected on the lessons learned from those terrifying weeks. The experience had taught her that the security and privacy she had taken for granted were more fragile than she had ever imagined, but it had also revealed reserves of strength and determination that she hadn't known she possessed. The simple act of finding a note in George's school bag had led to the discovery of one of the most serious security breaches in modern royal history, but it had also demonstrated that sometimes the greatest threats come not from dramatic, obvious dangers, but from the quiet, persistent erosion of the very foundations of safety and trust that protect the things we hold most dear. As Kate watched her children play in the gardens of Kensington Palace, now secured by new and more sophisticated protection measures, she understood that their safety would always require vigilance, courage, and the willingness to make difficult decisions when the stakes were highest. The note that had terrified her had ultimately become the key to protecting not just her own family, but the institution they represented and the values they were sworn to uphold. The crisis had passed, but its lessons would remain with Kate for the rest of her life, informing every decision she made as a mother, a wife, and a future queen. Sometimes, she reflected, the greatest victories come not from avoiding difficult choices, but from finding the courage to make the right choice when everything you love hangs in the balance.